The gate was frozen shut, and the woman standing at it had not eaten since the day before yesterday. She did not knock so much as lean against the wood, the way a person leans against a thing they no longer trust their own legs to do without. Her coat was a man's coat, too big, cinched with rope at the waist. Her hands were the color of a plucked chicken's skin, blue-white and raw. When the rancher came around the barn with a shotgun cracked over his arm expecting coyotes, he found instead a woman who looked at him with the flat, unafraid eyes of somebody who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, and so had nothing left to be frightened of, not even a gun. "I heard you lost your hand to the mill accident," she said, before he could speak. "I heard you've got 3 children and a 4th who won't stop crying, and a herd nobody's tending right, and a foreman who quit on you in October. I'm not asking you to feed me for nothing. I don't need charity. Just work. If you have ever stood at a gate in your own life, cold and proud and out of options, you already know how the rest of this story is going to feel in your chest. Stay until the end, because what this woman built out of one broken season is the kind of thing people in that county still tell their grandchildren about. If a story like that means something to you, subscribe and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. Now let's go back to where it started. To the winter, a starving widow walked up a frozen road with nothing but her mother's tin cup in her pocket and changed to Dying Ranch forever. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and 6 months before she stood at that gate, she had been a farmer's wife with a warm kitchen and a husband who sang while he split wood, off-key and unashamed of it. Daniel Calloway had not been a careful man exactly, but he had been a lucky one, and luck, Ruth had learned, was a currency that ran out without warning and without mercy. He'd gone up on the barn roof in September to patch a leak before the rains, the kind of small chore a man does 100 times without thinking, and the 201st time, the ladder had simply given way beneath him, rotten at the foot where neither of them had thought to look. He did not die right away. That was the part Ruth carried heaviest, the 3 days he lingered, lucid some hours and not others, asking her once in a clear and ordinary voice whether she'd remembered to feed the hens, as though the hens were the thing that mattered, as though he did not know what was happening to him. She had told him. Yes, she had lied to a dying man about hens because it was the only mercy left available to her. After the funeral, the farm went the way farms go when the debt was already deeper than anyone let the wife know about. There was a note against the land that Daniel had taken out the winter before, to buy seed after a bad year, and Ruth had signed it too, trusting her husband's math the way a woman is taught to trust her husband's math, and the bank did not care that she had buried him 3 weeks prior. The land went to auction in November. She kept what she could carry, a trunk of linens, her mother's tin cup, a Bible with her mother's name, and her own name written inside the cover in 2 different hands, 26 years apart, and $11. She did not go to her sister's house in the city, though her sister had written twice, begging her to come and be useful there, minding somebody else's children in exchange for a cot in the attic. Ruth had turned that letter over in her hands by the fire for a long while before she burned it, not out of spite, but because something in her had already decided, without her quite giving herself permission to decide it, that she was not going to spend the rest of her life being grateful in someone else's house for scraps she had not earned. She had grown up poor enough to know exactly what charity cost a person who took it. It cost you the right to complain. It cost you the right to disagree. It cost you, eventually, the plain conviction that you were worth feeding. And Ruth intended to keep that conviction if it was the last thing she owned. She had heard of the Weatherby Ranch the way you hear of most things in a small county, through the mouths of women at the mercantile, who did not know she was listening or did not care. Silas Weatherby had lost his wife, Eleanor, to a fever the winter before Ruth lost Daniel, almost to the week, and Ruth had thought at the time, with the strange numb detachment of grief, that there was a kind of terrible symmetry in it, 2 people in the same county being hollowed out by the same season a year apart, neither one aware of the other's ruin until much later. Weatherby had lost the use of his left hand in a mill accident that spring. The fingers curled now into a shape that could still grip a rope but never again a pen with any ease. And his foreman had quit in October, tired of running a ranch for a man who could no longer do the physical half of the work and would not, out of some stubborn, grief-soaked pride, hire on enough hands to cover the difference. The herd was said to be thin and badly bred and worse tended, the fences going soft in places, the hay put up wrong the year before so that a third of it had molded before Christmas. 4 children lived in that house. The oldest, a girl not yet 14 doing a grown woman's work, and the youngest, an infant, who by every account Ruth heard repeated over flour sacks and coffee tins, cried without stopping, as if the whole house had absorbed a grief too large for any of its inhabitants to name out loud, and the baby had simply taken up the job of naming it. Ruth walked to that ranch because there was nowhere else within a day's distance to walk to, and because something in the description of that house, ruined and grieving and short-handed, had struck her less as a warning than as an invitation. She was not naive about what people would say. A widow going alone to live and work on a widower's ranch. She had already decided, somewhere on the frozen road, that she did not have the luxury of caring what people would say. She had exactly enough conviction left in her to offer a fair trade, work for wages, and a roof, and she meant to make that trade so plainly and so immediately useful that no one, not even the gossips at the mercantile, would be able to make it sound like anything other than what it was. The rancher who met her at the gate did not lower his shotgun right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he cannot pay and does not want reminded of, sideways briefly before looking off toward the barn. Instead, "I can't pay much," he said finally, which was not a yes and was not a no, and Ruth understood immediately that this was the closest thing to an invitation he had left in him to give. "I didn't ask what you could pay," she said. "I asked to work." He studied her another moment, this stranger in a dead man's coat, and something in his face, some old muscle memory of decency he had not used in a year, moved just enough to unlatch the gate. She did not know, standing there with her feet gone numb inside her boots, that she had just walked into the middle of the hardest and most transforming season of both their lives, hers and his, and the lives of 4 children who had forgotten, separately and each in their own broken way, what it felt like to be looked after by somebody who was not simply too exhausted to leave the house. When she came into it properly the next morning to begin the work she'd been given, told her everything the county gossip had left out. It was not dirty exactly, but it had the particular disorder of a household run by a 14-year-old girl, doing her best and failing anyway, because there is no 14-year-old alive equal to running 4 children and a kitchen and half a ranch on no sleep and no help. The girl's name was May, and she met Ruth at the door with an expression so carefully neutral, so braced for one more disappointment, that Ruth recognized it instantly because she had worn that same face herself in the 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral. The face of a person keeping every single plate in the air by main force of will and terrified that admitting how heavy it was would make somebody take even the plates away. "I don't need help," May said, before Ruth had said a word. "I didn't come to help you," Ruth said. "I came to work the herd. If the kitchen happens to get easier because of it, that's your business, not mine." It was, of course, a small lie, the kind of lie a woman tells another woman when she understands that pride is the last coat a person has left to wear in winter, and she is not about to be the one who strips it off her. May's shoulders came down half an inch, and that half an inch told Ruth more about the last year in that house than any amount of gossip ever could have. The middle boy, Jonas, 11 years old and built like his father around the jaw, would not look at her at all that first week. He answered questions with single words flung sideways, and once, when she asked him to help her mend a section of fence, he told her flatly that she wasn't his mother and wasn't going to be, and stalked off before she could answer. She let him go. She had learned enough about anger in her own life to know that a boy's fury rarely means what it says on its face. It is very often grief that has not yet found a door small enough to fit through, so it batters instead at every door in the house, looking for the one that will finally hold. The third child, a boy of 7 named Tobias, did not speak at all. Not one word, not to her, not to his siblings, not, so far as she could tell, to his father either. He carried a stub of charcoal and a folded paper wherever he went, and he drew, constantly, small precise pictures of birds and fence posts, and she noticed on the second day a woman's face that she suspected without being told was his mother's, drawn from a memory that was already beginning to blur at the edges the way a child's memory of a dead parent always does. He did not run from Ruth. He simply watched her, the way you watch weather, waiting to see what kind of day it was going to turn out to be. And the baby, Delia, not yet 2, cried. She cried in the mornings, and she cried at supper, and she cried in the black hours before dawn, a thin, worn-down, exhausted sort of crying that had none of the outrage of a healthy child's tantrum in it. Only a kind of ambient grief too large for a body that's small to metabolize any other way. Ruth had heard once an old midwife say that infants know more than we credit them for, that they feel the weather of a house even when they cannot yet name a single thing in it. And standing in that kitchen on her first morning, listening to Delia cry from the next room while May tried, with visibly trembling hands, to get breakfast onto the table for everyone at once. Ruth understood that this house had been crying, in one form or another, out of every one of its rooms for the better part of a year. She did not go comfort the baby that first morning. She went out to the barn instead because she had been hired for the herd and she meant to prove her worth at the thing she'd been hired to prove it at before she tried to prove anything else, and because some instinct told her that a house this raw with grief did not need a stranger rushing in to mother it before she had earned the right. But she carried the sound of that crying out to the barn with her, and it sat in her chest all day like a stone, because 6 months before, in a different kitchen, in a different life, she had buried a child of her own, a daughter born too early and too small to survive the first week of a Kansas winter. And it would be a long while before she told them the herd, when she finally got a proper look at it in daylight, was worse than the gossip had let on. Weatherby ran mixed stock, mostly shorthorn crosses with a scattering of longhorn blood further back, on land that could have supported twice the animals if it had been managed with any sense at all. But the pasture rotation was non-existent. The cattle had been left to graze the same low bottomland all season, until it was chewed down to bare dirt in patches, while good grass stood ungrazed on the higher benches, because nobody had built the fence to direct the herd up there. The bulls ran with the cows year-round with no separation at all, which meant calves were dropping in every season, including the dead of winter, when a calf's odds of surviving the cold were worse than even. The hay that had been put up wrong the summer before was stacked in a shed with poor drainage, and a third of it, as she'd heard, had gone to black mold, which meant the stock had been getting less feed and worse feed all winter than they should have. She stood at the fence rail that first evening with a tin cup from her pocket in her hand, turning it over the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. An old habit for measuring grain rations with her mother years ago, back when there had been just enough grain to need careful measuring and not one bit more. Weatherby came up beside her, favoring his ruined hand the way she noticed he always did, tucking it slightly behind him as if it embarrassed him, though she suspected it embarrassed nobody but himself. "You're looking at my herd like it offends you personally," he said. It was the first thing approaching a joke she had heard out of him. "It doesn't offend me," Ruth said. "It tells me nobody's had the time to do right by it, which isn't the same thing as somebody doing wrong by it on purpose. Those are different problems. One of them I can fix." He looked at her a long moment in the fading light, and something in his face, still and closed as a shut door, opened perhaps a half-inch, the same half-inch May's shoulders had come down that morning. "I don't have money for another hand come spring," he said. "If what you're fixing cost more than what I've got." "It won't cost you money," Ruth said. "It'll cost you fence posts, which you've got timber enough on this land to cut yourself, and it'll cost you letting me move your bulls out of that pasture before February, which will cost you nothing but pride, since I expect somebody told you mixing them year-round was fine, and you believed it because you didn't have the time to learn otherwise." He didn't answer that directly, which she was already learning was his particular habit, starting toward a thing and then stopping short of it, the way a man tests ice before he trusts his full weight to it. "Eleanor used to say the same thing," he said instead, quietly, and then, as if he'd surprised himself by saying his dead wife's name out loud to a stranger, he turned and went back toward the house without finishing the sentence, and Ruth stood at the fence a while longer in the cold, turning the tin cup over in her hand, and did not follow him in. That was how the first week ended, with a house full of grief wearing 4 different faces, and a ranch full of neglect wearing the face of bad luck, and a woman standing between both of them with $11, a dead husband, a buried daughter she had told no one about, and a conviction, worn thin as her coat but not yet broken, that she was not asking for anything she had not already resolved to earn. The work did not get easier in the second week, but it did get clearer, and clarity, Ruth had found in her life, was very often worth more than ease. She rose before light, which was not difficult, since she had not slept a full night through since Daniel died and had stopped expecting to. She fed and watered before breakfast, checked the 2 cows nearest calving, and by the time May had flour on her hands for biscuits, Ruth was already back at the fence line with a hand saw and a coil of wire, working alone because Weatherby was out mending the mill wheel that had cost him his fingers in the first place. Piece of stubbornness Ruth privately thought bordered on penance rather than practicality. She built the first cross fence herself over 4 days, cutting posts from deadfall timber at the tree line rather than green wood, because green wood would rot in the ground the way the ladder rung that killed her husband had rotted, and she was not going to build anything on this ranch that carried even a whisper of that particular danger in it. Jonas watched her from the yard some afternoons, arms crossed, saying nothing, until the 4th day when she handed him the maul without asking whether he wanted it and said only, "Hold that post plum while I set it," and he did, wordlessly, and something in the doing of a task together without either of them having to admit that it mattered loosened a knot in him that a week of Ruth's kindness alone had not managed to touch. "My pa used to build fence with me," Jonas said, on the 5th day, not looking at her, driving a nail with more force than the nail required. "Did he?" Ruth said, not making it a question, giving him room to keep talking or not. "Before Ma died, he doesn't do much of anything now except the mill wheel. And that's just because it's broke and he can't stand a thing on this ranch being broke that he hasn't fixed yet, even though the mill's the reason his hand don't work right anymore, which is about the stupidest thing I ever heard if you want my opinion." "I do want your opinion," Ruth said, and meant it, and Jonas glanced at her sideways, surprised, the way a boy is surprised when an adult means a thing they say, instead of saying it to be kind. By the 2nd week she had also separated the bulls over Weatherby's initial and clearly reflexive objection, which she noted was an objection made out of habit rather than conviction, since he gave it up within a single conversation once she laid out in plain terms with no flourish. That a spring calving season instead of a scattered one meant every cow could be given the same close attention at once instead of the herd bleeding attention out in dribs and drabs across 10 months. And that the calves born together would grow together into a more even, more sellable set of yearlings the following fall. P did not thank her for the idea. He simply stopped objecting, and 2 mornings later she found the gate to the bull pasture already latched the way she'd asked, before she'd even gotten out to check it herself, which told her he had gone out in the dark to do it himself, rather than admit out loud that he agreed with her. The tin cup came into the story properly in the 3rd week, over the matter of the grain, and there was less of it than there should have been, the mill accident having cost Weatherby not just his fingers, but the better part of a month's milling capacity, while he tried, badly, to repair the wheel alone, and what grain they had needed stretching further than it wanted to stretch. Ruth took over the rationing without being asked, measuring feed by the same cup her mother had used to measure flour through 3 lean winters on a homestead that had, in its own time, very nearly starved them all before it didn't. She did not measure generously. She measured exactly, which is a harder discipline than measuring generously, because exact measuring requires you to know precisely how little a thing can survive on without failing, and to trust your own math enough to hold the line there even when your instinct is to give more out of guilt. "You're starving my herd," Weatherby said once, sharply watching her level off a cup rather than heap it, the closest thing to real anger she had heard from him. "I'm not starving anything," Ruth said, not looking up from the trough. "I'm making sure the grain you have lasts until the grass comes in, instead of running out 3 weeks before it does, which is what happens if you feed generous now and empty later. Ask anybody who's been through a bad winter, which mistake kills more stock. It isn't the tight ration, it's the generous one that runs out." He did not answer that, but he did not overrule her either, and when the grain held as she had promised it would straight through to the first green up on the south benches in April, he never brought it up again, though she noticed he watched her measure with something closer to attention than suspicion after that. The way a man watches a thing, he is beginning, cautiously, to trust. Tobias found his way to her not through any deliberate act of hers, but through the fence work, the way children often find their way to the adult who is simply present and steady, rather than the one actively pursuing them. He took to sitting on the top rail while she worked, drawing in his folded paper, and one gray afternoon in the 3rd week he held the paper out to her without a word, the way you'd hand somebody something too heavy to carry any longer alone. It was a drawing of the barn, precise down to the crooked hinge on the left door that Ruth had not consciously noticed herself until she saw it rendered exactly on his page, and beside the barn, small and slightly apart from it, a figure that could only be a woman, faceless, her features never quite committed to the paper. As if the boy could remember the shape of his mother perfectly, and the specifics of her face not at all, and it grieved him too much to guess. "That's a fine drawing," Ruth said, handing it back carefully, as if it might tear from a wrong touch. "You've got a good eye for what's true. That hinge really is crooked. I noticed it my first day, too." Tobias looked at her for a long moment, and then, in a voice so unused to itself that it came out cracked in the middle like a boy's voice breaking early, he said, "Nobody else sees the hinge." It was not much, 4 words from a boy who had said nothing at all in a year, but Ruth understood, sitting very still on the fence rail so as not to startle whatever fragile thing had just cracked open, that she had been handed something enormous, and that she had better be worthy of it. She did not go running to tell Weatherby that his son had spoken. She understood instinctively that this was Tobias's to give away in his own time, not hers to announce, and so she kept it the way you keep a coal alive under ash, quietly tending it without drawing attention to the tending, and over the following days Tobias spoke more, never much, a handful of words at a time, but always to her first. Before anyone else in the house, as if she had become the door small enough for him to finally fit his voice through, May's guard came down more slowly, because May's guard had been built out of a full year of being the only competent adult-shaped person in a house full of collapsing adults. And a girl who has had to hold that kind of weight does not set it down for a stranger simply because the stranger is kind. It was the 4th week before May let herself be helped, rather than merely tolerating help being present in the same room. Ruth had noticed the girl's hands chapped raw from washing in cold water, because the stove's water reservoir had never been repaired properly since a fitting cracked sometime the previous spring, and one evening, without asking, Ruth simply fixed it, packing the cracked joint with pine pitch and wrapped wire, the way her own mother had taught her to make do on a homestead, where a blacksmith was 2 days' ride away. May stood in the kitchen doorway watching her do it, arms crossed in a pose so exactly like her brother Jonas's that Ruth nearly smiled. "You didn't have to do that," May said. "That's not herd work. Nobody's paying you to fix the stove." "Nobody's paying me to notice your hands either," Ruth said. "But I noticed them anyway. And I had the pitch, so." May looked down at her own hands, reddened and cracked at the knuckles, as if seeing them freshly through somebody else's eyes for the first time in a year, and something in her face cracked too, not into words, not yet, but into the beginning of tears she had clearly been rationing, as carefully as Ruth rationed grain. Afraid that if she let herself cry even once, she would not be able to stop crying long enough to keep 4 people and a ranch running. Ruth did not go to her. She had learned, from the fence rail and from Tobias, that some doors have to be walked through by the person on the other side of them, not pulled open from without. She only kept working the wire into place, steady and unhurried, giving May a full minute of privacy inside her own kitchen to decide whether tonight was the night she let herself be 13 instead of 40. "He doesn't talk about her," May said finally, meaning her mother, meaning Eleanor, the words coming out low and fast as if she'd been holding them in a fist for a year and her hand had finally cramped open. "Pa, he won't say her name. He goes and works on that stupid mill wheel every day, like if he just fixes the thing that broke his hand, it'll fix everything else too. And none of us are allowed to talk about her, because it makes him go quiet and go out to the barn, so we don't, and I don't even remember what her voice sounded like anymore. And I'm scared none of us will. And there's nobody to ask, because he won't let anybody ask." Ruth set down the wrapped wire and turned, and this time she did cross the kitchen, and she put both her raw red hands over both of May's raw red hands. The 2 of them matched in that one particular ordinary damage, and she said the plain, unsentimental truth the way she had learned to say hard things, like laying a fact gently on a counter, rather than dressing it up as comfort it was not yet time to offer. "Grief doesn't go away because a house stops saying a name out loud," Ruth said. "It just goes and hides in the walls instead, and it makes everybody in the house a little sick without them knowing why. I lost somebody too this year. More than one somebody. I know what it costs to carry it alone in a house that's decided not to talk about it. You are not going to forget your mother's voice, May. But you might need somebody to help you remember it out loud, when your father's ready to let that happen. And until he is, you are allowed to be 13 in this kitchen instead of 40. I'll take some of the 40 from you. I've got room." May did cry then, finally, 3 weeks of held water breaking, all at once over a woman she had known less than a month, and Ruth held her the way she imagined with a raw ache she did not examine too closely. She might have held her own daughter, had her daughter lived past a week in a cold Kansas January, and she let May cry as long as May needed to. Because some debts of comfort are not paid in careful measure the way grain is, and a mother's arms, Ruth thought, borrowed or otherwise, are one of the few things in this world meant to be given generously rather than rationed. Weatherby did not see any of this happen, but he came in from the mill wheel that evening to find his daughter's face washed and calm, in a way it had not been in a year, and Ruth already back at the stove as if nothing at all had occurred, and, though he said nothing about it, he stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to before he took off his coat, watching the 2 of them, and something behind his eyes, guarded and grief-locked as a winter creek, moved for just a moment like water beginning, very slowly to thaw. The blizzard came in the 5th week, the way the worst weather in that country always seemed to come, with almost no warning at all, a sky that had been merely gray and heavy, turning within an hour to something the color of a held breath, and then the wind arriving all at once like a door slammed open. Ruth was out checking the 2 cows nearest calving when the first white wall of it hit the pasture, and she understood immediately, with the flat, clear certainty of somebody who had already survived 1 death by weather and did not intend to survive a second, that there was no getting both cows to shelter before the worst of it broke. She made the choice the way she made every hard choice, quickly and without self-pity. She got the closer cow, the one already straining, into the lean-to nearest the barn, and she left the second, a young heifer on her first calf, out in the open, tying a rope from the heifer's halter to the fence post, so the animal at least would not wander and be lost entirely in the whiteout. And then she went back for the first cow and stayed with her, because a cow that has never calved before needs a human hand more than a cow that has done this several times, and Ruth had exactly 1 pair of hands and had to spend them where they would do the most good, rather than where her guilt told her to spend them. The calf came breech, which she had half expected given how hard and how early the cow had begun straining, and Ruth worked in the freezing dark of the lean-to, with her arm in past the elbow, turning the calf by feel, because there was no light to work by and no time to fetch a lantern even if there had been. Murmuring to the cow the whole time in the low, steady voice she had once used in a different barn in a different life to calm her husband's temperamental mare, a voice that had nothing in its words and everything in its steadiness. The calf came at last, alive, gasping and slick in the freezing air, and Ruth worked it dry with handfuls of straw with fingers she genuinely was not certain. By that point, still belonged to her, they had gone so far past cold into something else, or some numb country beyond cold, where a person stops being entirely sure their body is still following instructions. It was Weatherby who found her there, an hour before dawn, when the worst of the wind had finally begun to lay down. He had gone out into the storm himself, half frantic, having realized only well into the night that Ruth was not in the house, and he found her in the lean-to with a living calf tucked against the cow's flank, and Ruth herself slumped against the wall beside them, not unconscious, but close enough to it that the distinction hardly mattered. Her lips gone the color of the sky outside. He did not say a single word. He picked her up, the way you pick up something you have only just understood, with a lurch of the stomach that you cannot afford to lose, and he carried her the whole distance to the house in the freezing dark, with his ruined hand pressed flat and useless against her back and his good arm doing the whole of the work. And he did not put her down until he had gotten her to the bed nearest the kitchen stove and built the fire up high enough to scorch the air. She came back to herself slowly over the better part of the day, wrapped in every blanket the house owned, with May spooning broth into her, with the same careful, competent hands Ruth had fixed the stove for a week before, and with Tobias sitting silent and watchful in the doorway, his charcoal for once left untouched in his pocket, and with Jonas hovering at the foot of the bed pretending he was only there to stoke the fire, and not, as was plainly true, standing guard. It was Weatherby who sat with her longest, through the deepest part of the afternoon when the others had been sent, gently but firmly by May, to see to the rest of the ranch. He sat in the chair beside the bed, with his ruined hand resting on his own knee, turning it over now and again as if still faintly surprised, after all this time, that it no longer worked the way it used to, and he did not speak for a long while, and Ruth, warming slowly back into her own body, did not push him to. "You could have died out there," he said finally, low. And there was an anger in it that she understood immediately was not anger at her at all, but the particular fury grief teaches a person, the fury of somebody who has already lost one person to weather and circumstance. "I know the risk of that country better than you'd think," Ruth said quietly. "I lost my husband to a rotten ladder rung nobody thought to check. I know exactly what carelessness costs. I wasn't careless out there. I made the choice I had to make, and I made it with my eyes open." "Why?" he said, and it was not really a question about the cow, or the calf, or the storm. It was a larger question than that, and they both understood it was. Sitting in the low firelight of a kitchen that had for the first time in a year the ordinary comfortable clutter of a house being properly lived in, rather than merely survived. Why had she walked here, starving, rather than gone to her sister's attic? Why had she risked her own life for a heifer that was not even hers? Why had she, in the space of 5 weeks, made herself indispensable to a house that had, until she arrived, forgotten it was allowed to want anything at all beyond mere endurance? Ruth was quiet a long moment, turning the question over the way she turned the tin cup over, weighing it before she answered. "Because I had a daughter," she said finally, the words coming out plain and unadorned, laid gently on the counter of the conversation the way she laid every hard truth. "She was born too early. The same month my husband died, though he never knew it. He was already gone by then. She lived 6 days. I never told you that, because there wasn't a place in the last 5 weeks where it seemed like the kind thing to say, with your own house already so full of grief, It didn't have room for mine on top of it. But I know what it is to lose someone. You would have given anything, everything, every year I had left to keep. And when I saw 4 children in this house half orphaned by grief that nobody was letting them speak, and a herd going to ruin because the man who owned it was too busy drowning to notice the water was rising around everybody else too, I understood that I could either go be quietly useless in my sister's attic, minding somebody else's children while my own grief ate me alive in private, or I could come here and be loudly, stubbornly, immovably useful to people who actually needed the particular thing I had left to give. I chose useful. I'd choose it again. Weatherby did not say anything for a long time after that. He only reached out, slowly with his good hand, and covered hers where it lay on top of the blanket, and the two of them sat like that in the firelight while outside the last of the storm finished, laying itself down over a ranch that had, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened. The gossip started, as gossip in a small county always seems to. Not with malice exactly at first, but with the particular hunger certain people have for a story that lets them feel superior to somebody else's misfortune. Mrs. Sia Pruitt, the banker's wife, was the one who carried it furthest and fastest, though she would have told you, had you asked her directly, that she was only concerned, only looking out for the moral welfare of a grieving household, only doing the Christian duty of a respectable woman keeping watch over her neighbors. What she was in fact doing, Ruth understood clearly enough the first time she felt the weight of the woman's stare across the mercantile in town, was enjoying, in the particular joyless way certain people enjoy such things, the spectacle of a starving widow living unchaperoned under a widower's roof, and turning that spectacle into currency at every quilting circle and church supper in the county, a woman alone with a man alone. Mrs. So Pruitt said to a cluster of women by the flour barrels, her voice pitched to carry exactly as far as she wanted it to carry, and no farther, which happened to be precisely as far as Ruth's own ears, standing not 10 feet away with a list of supplies in her raw hands. And those children exposed to it. I don't say she isn't a hard worker. I only say a decent woman would have found a more respectable arrangement. I only say it's not my place to judge, but somebody ought to think of those children. Ruth did not turn around. She had learned, in 5 weeks of measuring grain exactly rather than generously, the discipline of holding a line without flinching, and she held it now, finishing her list, paying for her supplies with wages she had in fact fairly and transparently earned, and walking out of that mercantile with her spine straight and her raw hands steady, though something in her chest burned all the way home, with a fury she did not let herself show until she was alone at the fence line an hour later, hammering a post into ground so hard frozen it fought her at every blow, working the anger out through her arms rather than her mouth, because she had also learned, a long time before this winter, that a woman's anger, however justified, is very often used against her more effectively than her calm ever could be. It was Amos, the old hand who had stayed on at the Weatherby Ranch through the worst of the past year out of a loyalty that had nothing to do with wages, who told her later that week that the talk had reached further than the mercantile, that it had reached, in fact, all the way to Elias Holloway's desk at the county bank, and that Holloway, who held the note on the last unpaid stretch of Weatherby land from a loan taken out the winter Eleanor died, had begun making noises about calling the note due early, citing, among other things, concerns about the moral character of the household as reflected in its arrangements. It was not, strictly, a legal reason to call a note. It was, Amos said grimly, spitting into the dirt beside the corral fence, exactly the kind of thing a banker says when he is looking for cover to do a thing he already wanted to do for other reasons, entirely. And the other reasons, in Holloway's case, were not hard to guess. Weatherby's land ran along the creek bottom that the railroad survey had been eyeing for a spur line the year before, and a note called due on a grieving one-handed rancher with no foreman was a note a canny banker might hope to buy back cheap at auction, land and water rights included, to do long before anybody from the railroad ever had to pay a fair price for it. He's not going to say that part out loud, Amos said. He'll dress it up in Sunday clothes about respectability and hardship, and half this county will nod along because it's easier to believe a man's just being prudent than to believe he's being greedy. But I've known Elias Holloway 30 years, and I never once saw him be prudent when there wasn't a profit hiding behind the prudence. Ruth carried this news to Weatherby herself that evening, laying it out the way she laid out every hard thing, plainly, without softening it into something smaller than it was. She watched him take it the way she had watched him take everything since the mill accident, with a kind of exhausted, grief-worn stillness that she was coming to understand was not weakness at all, but a very particular kind of endurance. A man conserving every ounce of feeling he had left because he had already spent so much of it in one terrible year, that he had learned to ration his own reactions the way she rationed grain. "Let him call the note," Weatherby said finally. And there was an old bitterness in it, the voice of a man who had already, privately, half decided he did not deserve to keep what he could no longer properly tend. Maybe he's not wrong to. Look at the state I let this place get to before you walked up that road. Maybe it's better land in hands that can work it right. That, Ruth said, sharper than she had spoken to him yet, is grief talking, not sense. And I won't sit here and let you hand a greedy man your children's home, because grief has convinced you that you don't deserve to keep it. This ranch was thin and badly bred and short on hands, Silas, not beyond saving. There's a difference, and I told you that the first evening I stood at your fence, and I meant it then and I mean it more now because I've had 5 weeks to prove it. Your herd is already stronger than it was in November. Your calving's going to come in tighter and healthier this spring than it has in 3 years, if Amos's memory of past seasons is worth anything. And it is. You are not beyond saving either. Whatever that mill wheel keeps trying to convince you of every single day you go out there to fix a thing that can't fix what's actually broken in you. Let Holloway try his note. We'll meet him with a herd count and a season's plan he can't argue down in front of witnesses, because I don't intend to let a banker's greed dressed up as morality take 4 children's home out from under them, while I've got breath left to argue against it. Something in the set of Weatherby's jaw shifted, hearing that, some old stubbornness reasserting itself that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the man he must have been before Eleanor died, before the mill wheel took his hand and, with it, his sense of his own usefulness. "You'd fight a county banker for a ranch that isn't yours," he said, not quite a question. "I'd fight anybody trying to take a home out from under children who've already lost enough," Ruth said. Whether the deed's got my name on it or not was never the point. He looked at her a long moment across the kitchen table, the fire between them throwing warm light up the side of his face, and he started to say something, his mouth opening around the shape of a word. And then, in the way she had already come to recognize as entirely his own particular habit, he stopped himself just short of finishing it, the sentence dying half-born, the way it always seemed to, when it came anywhere near a feeling too large for him to trust himself to say out loud. Ruth did not press him to finish it, but she filed the shape of that unfinished sentence away, the way she filed away everything useful, for a day when she judged he might finally be ready to say the rest of it. The public reckoning, when it came at the spring social, held at the Grange Hall in April, an event Ruth would have happily skipped entirely had May not begged her to come, and had Weatherby not, in his own quiet way, made it clear that he intended to go and intended for her to be beside him when he did, a decision that was in that county, its own kind of announcement, whatever words either of them did or did not say to accompany it. Mrs. Pruitt had clearly been waiting for exactly this occasion, a hall full of witnesses, to say in public what she had been saying in private for 2 months, and she found her opening early in the evening, cornering Ruth near the refreshment table with a smile so brittle and so carefully arranged it looked almost painful to hold. "I do think it's remarkable," Mrs. Pruitt said loud enough to draw the attention of the women nearest her, "how quickly a woman with nothing at all can make herself so very comfortable in a grieving man's household. Some might even call it opportunistic. though I'm sure I don't mean anything unkind by it." The hall had gone quiet enough around them that Ruth understood the woman had timed this deliberately, had waited for precisely the lull in the fiddle music that would let her words carry farthest. Ruth felt the old instinct rise in her, the instinct to go small, to apologize, to make herself smaller and less visible the way poverty had taught her, over and over, was the safest way to survive a room that had decided to judge her. She set the instinct down, deliberately. The way you set down a heavy basket, you have decided you are done carrying. "I came to that ranch starving, Mrs. Pruitt," Ruth said, and her voice, though not loud, carried with the particular clarity of a person who has stopped being afraid of being heard. "I asked for work, not charity, because I have never in my life wanted a single thing I hadn't earned, and I still don't. In the 5 months since, I have re-fenced 60 acres of that ranch with my own hands, separated a herd that was breeding itself into ruin, and brought a calf through a blizzard that would have taken it and very likely me along with it, had I been the sort of woman who quit when a thing got difficult. The Weatherby herd has more than doubled its calf count from last spring to this one, and every animal on that place is better fed on less grain than it was getting before, because I know how to measure exactly what a thing needs instead of guessing generously and running short later. I don't know what you'd call that, Mrs. Pruitt, but where I come from, we call it work, and we call a woman who does it honestly a good deal more respectable than a woman who spends her evenings guessing at the moral failings of people whose actual circumstances she has never once bothered to ask about." There was a silence in the hall of the particular kind that follows a thing said plainly and truly in a room that had been prepared, by weeks of careful gossip, to hear something else entirely. It was Doc Reyes, the county doctor, who broke it, an old man who had delivered half the children in that hall and buried a good many of their grandparents besides, and whose word, everyone knew, carried a weight in that county, that Mrs. Pruitt's careful gossip could never quite match. "I've been out to the Weatherby place twice this spring," Doc Reyes said, into the quiet. "Once for a fever in the youngest, and once just to look in on things, being an old family friend of Eleanor's people. I'll tell this hall plainly what I told my own wife privately weeks ago. I have never in 30 years of doctoring this county seen a household turned around the way that one has been turned around this winter. Those children are eating regular, sleeping regular, and the youngest, whose crying half this hall has heard about secondhand for a year, has slept clear through the night every time I've called since February. I don't know what you'd call the woman responsible for that, Mrs. Pruitt, but I'd call her the best thing to happen to that family since before Eleanor took sick, and I'd thank this hall to remember that respectability was never about who a woman lives near. It's about what she does with her hands and her honesty. And Ruth Calloway's got more of both than most people in this room. It was Mrs. Otis, Holloway's own housekeeper of all people, who spoke next, a woman who had, by her own later admission to Ruth, disapproved of the arrangement as thoroughly as anybody in the county when the talk first started, and who had, over 2 months of watching Ruth at the mercantile and the church steps, quietly changed her mind entirely. "I'll say something I oughtn't, seeing whose roof I sleep under," Mrs. Otis said, her chin lifted. "But I've heard Mr. Holloway talking of calling due the note on that ranch, dressing it up as concern for decency, when any fool with eyes can see it's the creek bottom he wants and not a widow's virtue he's worried over. I think this county ought to know exactly whose morality is actually for sale here, and it isn't Ruth Calloway's." The hall broke into a low murmur, at that the particular murmur of a room realizing, all at once, that it had been handed the wrong story from the start, and Mrs. Pruitt, for the first time in the whole exchange, had nothing at all to say, standing very still by the refreshment table with her brittle smile, finally, entirely gone. Holloway did try to call the note the following week, regardless, cornered now by his own exposed motives, but too stubborn or too greedy to back down entirely, and it was here that the season's real numbers did their own quiet, unglamorous work of vindication, because numbers, unlike gossip, do not care what a room believes about a woman's morality. Weatherby laid the herd count out on the banker's own desk, with Amos and Doc Reyes and, at Ruth's insistence, May herself standing as witnesses, since May had kept the ledger faithfully all season under Ruth's teaching and knew every figure in it better than either adult. The calf count stood at better than double the spring before. The hay was properly cured and stored dry for the first time in 3 years. The grain, rationed exactly rather than generously, had lasted the whole winter with a full month's surplus left over, a surplus Ruth had insisted on keeping in reserve rather than selling off, precisely because she had learned the hard way what it costs a household to run short. Against numbers like that, laid out plainly on a banker's own desk by witnesses the whole county trusted, Holloway's talk of moral hazard withered into what it had always actually been. A greedy man's excuse dressed in Sunday clothes, and he let the note stand, unable to find a single legitimate reason left to call it, muttering something about reconsidering terms that nobody in the room bothered to dignify with an answer. It was that same week, in the ordinary hour after supper, when the children had gone up and the kitchen had settled into the particular quiet Ruth had come to love best in that house, that Weatherby finally finished the sentence he had been starting and stopping for 2 months. He had come to stand near the stove where she was banking the fire for the night, and he had that look on his face she recognized now, the look of a man testing ice before trusting his weight to it, and this time, instead of stopping, he let himself go all the way through. "I started to tell you something the night of the blizzard," he said, "about why I couldn't lose you out there. I stopped myself because I wasn't ready to know what it meant yet. I think I've known what it means for some while now, and I think you've known it too, and I'm done letting a mill wheel or a dead wife's memory or my own fool pride keep me from saying it plain the way you say everything plain to me. I don't want you here as a hired hand anymore, Ruth. I haven't wanted that in a long while. I want you here because this is your home too if you'll have it, and because these children are already halfway to calling you what I think they've been wanting to call you since the week you fixed that stove, and because I've never in my life met a woman who could hold a line the way you hold one, or this family, or I myself, look like without you holding it." Ruth set down the poker slowly and turned to face him fully in the low firelight, and she did not say anything clever or careful, because she had learned, across a whole hard season, that the truest things are always the plainest ones. Then, "Stay finished," she said. "Say the rest of it. Stay," he said. "Marry me, Ruth. Not because you saved this ranch, though God knows you did, but because you saved every soul living on it, mine included. And I don't want to spend whatever years I've got left pretending I don't know that." She crossed a small distance of that kitchen and put her raw hand, work-worn and sure, into his ruined one. The hand that could no longer hold the pen but could. She had learned across a whole winter of watching him work, still hold nearly everything else that mattered, and she said yes, plainly, the way she said everything. And outside the window the last of that winter's frost was already beginning, in the dark, to give way to the first soft edge of a spring. Neither of them, 5 months before, standing on opposite sides of a frozen gate, would have believed themselves capable of surviving into, let alone one they would come to share. The wedding was small, held at the ranch itself in early May, with the fruit trees just coming into bloom along the creek. And it was May who stood nearest Ruth through the whole of it, dressed in a gown Ruth had helped her sew, from cloth bought with the season's first calf sale. No longer the exhausted, prematurely aged girl who had met Ruth at the door 8 months before, with a face braced for one more disappointment, but a girl who had been allowed finally to be 13 again while somebody else carried the 40. Jonas stood at his father's side taller already than he'd been in the winter, no longer flinging his words sideways but standing straight and easy, the anger that had been grief in disguise all along having found, over the season, enough small, ordinary places to set itself down, Tobias spoke the vow's witness line clear and unhesitating when Doc Reyes asked the children if they gave their blessing, 4 whole sentences strung together without a single hitch, and Ruth, hearing him, had to look hard at the fruit blossoms overhead for a long moment to keep her own composure. And Delia, not yet crying at all anymore, not that season, not for months, sat propped on Amos's knee at the edge of the gathering, gurgling happily at the fiddle music, a barometer, finally, of a house that had healed. Ruth kept the tin cup her whole life after that, though she never again needed to measure grain quite so exactly as she had that first hard winter. Because a ranch doubled in herd and mended in spirit rarely runs so close to the bone again once it has been properly set right. She kept it on the kitchen windowsill instead, where the light caught the dented tin every morning, and when her own children, born into that house in the seasons that followed, asked her once, years later, why she kept an old battered cup with nothing special about it in a house that could easily have afforded finer things, she told them the plain truth, the way she had always told the plain truth, that the cup had taught her in the hardest winter of her life exactly how much a person can survive on if they measure it honestly, and exactly how much more a person can build once somebody finally lets them. Amos, grown old and slower by then, but never gone from that ranch, was fond of telling the story to anyone who'd sit still for it at the Grange Hall socials, embellishing it a little more with every passing year the way old men do. Though the heart of it never changed no matter how much the edges grew in the telling. A starving widow had walked up a frozen road with nothing but a dead husband, a buried daughter, and a tin cup in her pocket, and had asked for one thing only, not comfort, not pity, not a roof given freely, but the plain and simple dignity of work fairly offered and fairly done. And in the space of one hard season, she had doubled a broken man's herd, mended 4 grieving children back into a family, and built, out of nothing but her own 2 raw hands, and her refusal to accept anything she had not earned, a home sturdier than the one either of them had lost. That, Amos always said, setting down his coffee cup at the end of the telling, was the whole of the lesson in it, plain as anything. A house is not made, a home, by the charity poured into it, but by the honest work 2 broken people are finally, stubbornly, and against every hard winter that came before, for the rest of their lives,